Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Pandemic and Human Rights in Latin America. We have joining us our moderator for the panel and also our three panelists for the event, as well as you, our wonderful audience. I want to let you know that we've actually pre-recorded the presentations for tonight, and we have more in-depth introductions of the panelists and some information in the video presentation that you're going to see. So I'm going to keep this introduction pretty short. I'm going to say just three things before we start. One is, thank you for coming to the final event of Human Rights Week this year, and we hope that we will be back next year. Two is that, again, the panelists are here live for discussion, even though their presentations are pre-recorded. And the discussion is going to be moderated by having audience members put their questions in the chat. So if you think of a question while the presentations are ongoing, please feel free to go ahead and type that in the chat, and then we'll pick up as many as we can once Q&A begins. That's just to say you don't have to wait until the presentation is over. You can go ahead and start with your questions. And then the third thing is you can also note in the chat if you're having any trouble hearing or seeing the shared videos that I can try to troubleshoot as much as possible. So thanks everyone, and we're actually going to go ahead and get right to it. I'll share this video and we'll get started with our presentation.
Hello, I'm Laura Alexander, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I'd like to welcome you to this Human Rights Forum and CHARLA, co-sponsored by the Goldstein Center for Human Rights and the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies at UNO. Today, our panelists will be speaking on the topic, Pandemic and Human Rights in Latin America. This event is part of Human Rights Week, which is a series of educational events on human rights topics sponsored by the Goldstein Family Community Chair. The Human Rights Forum is an educational series sponsored by the UNO Goldstein Center for Human Rights. At each forum, a panel of expert speakers discusses a contemporary human rights topic. CHARLA, which means chat in English, is a series created by the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies to engage the UNO and greater Omaha community in informed conversations about Latino and Latin American related issues. For this event, we'll be hearing about human rights issues in light of the COVID-19 pandemic from three scholars with expertise in Latin American history, politics, and migration and asylum seeking at the U.S.-Mexico border. Our moderator is Dr. Cristián Doña-Reveco, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies. Dr. Doña-Reveco will introduce our topic and panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. With over 300,000 deaths, Latin America is one of the hardest hit regions of the world by this pandemic. With an estimated contraction of the region's GDP of 9% in 2020 and by more than 7% in 2021, it is also expected to be the hardest hit region by the economic impact of its recessions. These effects are magnified by high levels of inequality, low levels of trust in public institutions, as well as increasing immigration flows from Venezuela and the Northern Triangle. To talk about how the region has confronted COVID-19, we have with us Reverend Dr. Helen Boursier, Dr. Brett Kyle, and Dr. Pedro Cantisano. First, Dr. Brett Kyle is an assistant professor of political science and a member of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, OLLAS, and the Goldstein Center for Human Rights, faculty at UNO. He is the author of Recycling Dictators in Latin American Elections, Legacies of Military Rule and the Forthcoming Military Courts, Civil-Military Relations, and the Legal Battle for Democracy, The Politics of Military Justice.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be making my remarks in three parts. First, looking at the pandemic itself in Latin America. Second, moving on to how politics is affecting the pandemic. And then looking at how the pandemic is affecting politics in the region. I think the place to start is to acknowledge that the Americas are the epicenter of observed cases of coronavirus and deaths from coronavirus worldwide currently. According to the Johns Hopkins COVID-19 dashboard that's tracking confirmed cases globally, 6 of the top 10 countries of the world with the highest number of cases are in the Americas. That's the United States, followed by Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, and finally Argentina. And the story is similar when it comes to recorded deaths from the novel coronavirus. Of the top 10 countries in the world that have experienced the largest number of deaths, 4 of those are in the Americas. That's the United States, followed by Brazil, Mexico, and Peru. Those are the countries with the most total cases, but when we account for population size, the story looks even worse for Latin America. Looking at deaths per 100,000 population, Peru has experienced the highest rate, at 96 deaths per 100,000 population, followed by Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, the United States, Mexico, and Colombia. And for those countries in Latin America that have been the hardest hit, they have exhibited a similar pattern. Most reported their first confirmed case in early March, and by May we're seeing explosive growth in daily confirmed new cases, to the point that thousands of new cases were being confirmed each day in each of those countries. The potential positive sign here to note is that as of mid-September, in almost all of those countries, the current 7-day average is on the decline. But there are thousands of confirmed new cases each day, but fewer than in previous days. So from a pure health standpoint of experiencing the virus, this has hit Latin America very hard. And it has also had an important impact on politics and the economy. It has been very disruptive in many places. It is exacerbating economic inequality. It has also led governments in the region to intensify the kinds of practices that they often reach for in times of crisis, namely harsh policing tactics, the use of the military as police, and the use of the military as an arm of government to coordinate and enforce policy. Before I get into that part of things, though, I think we can see some important parallels in the response in Latin America with what has happened here in the United States, which is what brings us to the point of how politics has affected the pandemic and centers on the region's current experience with populism. From the standpoint of leadership in a number of countries, Brazil, Mexico, Nicaragua, Venezuela in particular, they started out in a weakened position to be able to manage a public health crisis like this, because as in the United States, the current president subscribed to a style of populist politics that is rooted in denialism, an anti-science mentality, and a general anti-expertise mentality. Those are core tenets of that style of political movement because it is how the leader aggregates power to themselves, undermining forms of authority other than their own, undermining voices that are not their own. And this is not by accident. This is a feature of populism. It relies on the leader attempting to make themselves indispensable to their followers, and crucially, to be the only source of information that their followers listen to. But obviously, this becomes a serious threat to the health and well-being of the people of the country when faced with an emergency like this, where denial and disinformation only facilitate the spread of the virus, which isn't listening to those leaders. President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil probably exemplifies this best, but AMLO in Mexico, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua all fit this pattern as well, where they have alternately pretended the virus didn't exist, downplayed its seriousness, undermined their own health ministry's guidelines by mocking mask wearing, or setting a bad example by not physically distancing from others when they are making public appearances, and so on. For Mexico, with AMLO, that is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the lack of forthrightness in the response is not solely about the virus itself, but also the economic damage as well. The Mexican economy was already in trouble before the pandemic. The country was already in recession, and at this point, key sectors like tourism have collapsed. The country has lost an estimated 12 million jobs in recent months, and more Mexicans are being pushed below the poverty line. The government's response has been austerity measures rather than trying to alleviate some of that economic damage from the pandemic and from the measures necessary to reduce exposure. And there's been very little justification or explanation as to why the government has pursued the policies it has. In Nicaragua, rather than trying to institute measures to combat the virus, Daniel Ortega's government in March instead tried to actually create crowds, to encourage crowds to gather together. At the same time, Ortega himself wasn't seen in public for about a month, and so that played into the uncertainty, and then there was speculation that he himself might have been ill or worse. He eventually reappeared, but his government's response has not changed. Ortega has denied that the country has any problem at all, and doctors and other medical professionals who have spoken out against the government's response have reportedly been fired from their jobs in hospitals around the country. In Venezuela, where the country was already in a severe economic and public health crisis, the Maduro government has responded to the pandemic by ratcheting up the repression against citizens, including reportedly against doctors who have spoken out against the government's handling of the coronavirus. The government has turned the virus into a way of targeting people, especially potential opposition figures, detaining and threatening to detain people they accuse of having come into contact with the virus. So clearly a bad situation getting worse there. And unfortunately, for other countries that had a slightly more normal initial response to the virus, things also are not going well. Peru and Argentina, for example, that took the virus seriously from the start, implemented shutdowns like the ones we have seen in many places, but they ultimately were not paired with the other necessary work to have a successful long-term response. In Peru, for example, the country implemented a thoroughgoing lockdown in March, including a 10 p.m. curfew, which is still in effect, but testing has been limited, and they still don't have a national contact tracing program or system for quarantine when someone is found to have the virus. The story is similar in Argentina, where the Fernandez government implemented a lockdown to try to flatten the curve and prevent too much pressure from being put on the country's healthcare system. And it worked for a little while, but the moment they tried to reduce some of those restrictions, they saw an uptick in cases that just meant the problem was delayed. And again, the other elements of the response that would be necessary are lacking. In terms of how this is affecting politics, we tend to see a pattern emerging across the region whereby countries are turning to the armed forces to, for example, deliver food, as they have done in Ecuador, or to enforce the curfew, as they have done in Peru. And it takes that sort of character to the way the military is involved. In Peru, for example, the government called up 10,000 reservists to increase the ranks of the military because the military was the one to help enforce the curfew. And gave the military the power to detain people. Within the first month, the police and military had detained almost 36,000 people for breaking curfew and other restrictions. And among the things the Peruvian government did as part of this military mobilization was to pass a new law called the Police Protection Law, which grants legal protection to police and military personnel who shoot someone in the conduct of their duties. That is to say, it keeps them from being criminally responsible for those actions. Or put another way, this is a charter for impunity. So this is a really dangerous development. We see similar kind of processes playing out in Colombia, where the military and police have enforced curfews and other restrictions. And just days ago, a 46-year-old man was killed by police officers in the conduct of an arrest whether they were trying to arrest him for violating social distancing rules. And this touched off days of protests and violent unrest that has injured at least 150 protesters and police. So I think we can conclude by emphasizing these specific points on human rights, that we have some clear issues here with erosion of democracy by empowering militaries and the arbitrary detention of individuals. And I think we could add to this the very point of the human right of public health related to detentions themselves, because the irony of the mass detentions that have taken place in many countries is that it's obviously aggregating many people together at a time when they're being exposed to the virus or potentially exposed to the virus. So the detentions themselves are problematic as a human rights issue on their own, and also with their secondary effects on health related to the coronavirus, as well as mental health, given the stress of these kinds of detentions in emergency conditions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle. Next, Dr. Pedro Cantisano. He is an assistant professor of Latin American history at UNO. Before joining us, he was a researcher at a law school in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where he worked on projects related to human rights and the relationship between courts and politics. He's currently writing a book on public health, urban reform, and civil rights in early 20th century Brazil.
So as of now, Brazil has over 4 million cases of coronavirus and 130,000 deaths. It's second only to the United States in the world. It's doing bad in every single possible statistic that you may consider regarding COVID-19. The COVID crisis hit Brazil during an economic and political crisis. And to understand it, we have to go back a little bit in time. The president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, was elected on an anti-corruption, anti-crime platform in 2017, and has since used hate and social media and division to consolidate a 30% basis of political supporters. Bolsonaro has used the pandemic to attack his enemies and further consolidate this basis. One critic has called Bolsonaro's government as the government of death. That means that his supporters and himself openly praised the Brazilian military dictatorship that killed and tortured during the 1960s and 70s with several violations of human rights. They also openly attacked the Amazon and indigenous people, showing no regard for the future of the country and the planet. In addition to that, Bolsonaro has openly supported the private usage of weapons, which, as for now, has only benefited criminal militias. And of course, in addition to all of those problems, they have discredited scientific evidence that could have saved lives during this COVID-19 crisis. Attacks on scientific institutions, both health institutions and environmental institutions, is an integral part of this government that essentially thrives on fake news and conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, when the pandemic hit, government was investing in certain economic reforms to cut spending in Brazil. The economy was bad anyway, despite some promises made by a finance minister. And of course, this cutting spend policies, they had to be sort of adjusted for the pandemic. So now government pays a very small allowance to the poor to try to sustain the economy where the pandemic requires people to stay at home. Well, the allowance is so small and government has pressured for it to be even smaller that people have to go to work anyway. So it hasn't worked as in other places in the world. In fact, people in Brazil haven't been very strict with their social distancing practices, even though there are policies coming from state and city governments. So people have to go to work because they have to feed themselves and the allowance is too short. And in addition to that, there are other factors that contribute to it. So for example, the basis of support for the government, the Bolsonarista base has in fact denied the seriousness of the pandemic as the president has. So all of this economic downturn, in addition to this political climate of scientific denial, is in fact affecting how people deal with the pandemic. So it is a very grim scenario, and the future, or the near future, is probably a pessimistic one for Brazil. But what I wanted to talk about is tell you that not all is lost for Brazil. And not all is lost for Brazil because the country has a long history of public health investments and also investments in public health research. That happened because in the 1980s, when Brazil transitioned from a dictatorship into a democracy, Brazilians made an agreement that was consolidated in a new constitution, the Constitution of 1988, which has allowed government and even, in fact, required government to invest in a national public health system. So this system has been expanding since the 1980s. It has free consultations, free surgery, free even preventive medicine, all encompassed by the state of Brazil. Of course, there are problems with the quality of services, with budget spending. The service has been under attack since it was created in the 1980s because of austerity policies, the problems with budget and sort of revenue in the state of Brazil. But nonetheless, states continue and governments continue to invest in this public health system. And that happens because public health in Brazil is not a partisan question. It is written in the Constitution that people have a right, a human right, a constitutional right to public health. In fact, the Constitution of 1988 incorporated human rights advancements that followed the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights. So the Constitution requires government to spend money with this national public health system. So it doesn't matter which party, in fact, is in power. It is a constitutional requirement that the system is in place. And of course, the system during the pandemic has gained a prominent feature in the news and among common people. They now defend the system. They have been defending for a while, but they defend even strongly the system precisely because the public health system has allowed people or some people at least, it cannot save everyone from COVID-19, but has expanded treatment, expanded the amount of intensive care units available, and therefore has sort of held together the society. Even though there are over 100,000 deaths in the country, the system, in fact, has prevented a total collapse of healthcare in Brazil. So this is the first history that starts in the 1980s, and that has created a human right, a constitutional right to health, and a governmental obligation, regardless of political party, to invest in public health, and has held together people that pretty much have defended the system during the pandemic. The other history is even a longer one, which is a history of investment in public health research. So since the early 1900s, Brazil has invested in research to figure out vaccines, for example, right? And that's exactly what's being done right now with state institutions, so publicly funded institutions investing in research about or to try to find a vaccine for the coronavirus. This has been done in cooperation historically with countries such as the United States and others as well. In fact, as of now, because Brazil has such a large and diverse population, other countries like the US, Russia, China, the British, they all are now signing agreements to do research about a vaccine in Brazil. But that only happens, so this is not a one-way street. That only happens because Brazilian public institutions have sought those contracts with those institutions in other places to try to find a vaccine for coronavirus. So this is the second story, the story of public health research, despite all the attacks that those institutions have suffered from Bolsonaro's and his political basis. This is a long history of investment in public health research that might put Brazil at the forefront of finding a vaccine for coronavirus. So we have this grim picture in Brazil, the politicization of the pandemic in all different levels, the economic need that drives people not to obey social distancing measures. But on the other hand, we have also a long history of public health research and also of a right to public health, a right to healthcare in the country, which have been holding together and give us some hope for the future. So even though the Brazilian society and Brazilian government have no commitment with crashing the numbers of coronavirus, I think that the previous commitments that were made during the 1988 Constitutional Convention and later with the renovation of those investments in public health research, they might sort of give us some hope for the country of Brazil in the midst of this pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Cantisano. Next in our program, we have Reverend Dr. Helen Boursier. Dr. Boursier is a public theologian, educator, author, activist, ordained Presbyterian minister, and artist. Pastora Elena has been a volunteer chaplain with refugee families seeking asylums since 2014, and she teaches theology and religious studies at the College of St. Scholastica. Her books include Desperately Seeking Asylum, Testimonies of Trauma, Courage, and Love, published in 2019, and The Ethic of Hospitality, an interfaith response to U.S. immigration policies, also published in 2019. Forthcoming books in 2021 include The Art of Witness, a public theology of arts-based research, and also in 2021, Overcoming the Limitations of Christian Law for Refugees Seeking Asylum. She's also the editor for the Rowan and Littlefield Handbook on Women's Studies in Religion, which will be published in 2021. Today, she'll tell us how asylum seekers have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Cristián, for your introduction. I very much appreciate the warm welcome and also for the invitation to be here. Thank you very much. I bring you greetings from the border, from the ministry associates that work together with assisting the families who are seeking asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, and also from the families themselves, the families who fear that they have gotten lost in the shuffle, if you will, the shuffle of COVID-19. Of the social restlessness in the United States and also with the election. So the family is asked to be remembered and to be remembered with how much COVID-19 has impacted their lives. There has been very few cases in Matamoros, Mexico, which is the scene in the bridge behind me. That red arc takes you across the river to Matamoros, Mexico, which is where the families are. And there have only been 4 or 5 reported cases of COVID-19 in that encampment community. But they have been greatly impacted by the policies because of COVID-19. And that's what I want to share with you today. So there's a little bit of a backstory that's important to understand. And my training is in theology and in religious studies and also as a clergy person. But I've had to come to learn the laws because I'm asked so often about the rhetoric that you hear in social media and in the public about the rule of law and what about all those laws and aren't they breaking them? So I've had to come to understand them so I can explain the backstory of how we got to be to the crisis, the humanitarian crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so let's begin with the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees and the concept of non-refoulement, which says that no nation, no receiving nation like the United States would send an asylum seeker back to any place where their lives would be at great risk. That's a 1991 United Nations on High Commissioner for Refugees, and the United States is a signatory nation for that, which means we agree that we will not send anyone back where they'll be at great risk, which is what we've done with the families in Mexico. And the United States, we have the Refugee Act of 1980, which says that we will give humanitarian assistance to asylum seekers. In 1996, Congress specified that asylum seekers could seek asylum at anywhere along any U.S. border and not be deemed illegal aliens, that they had the right, as they were fleeing for their lives, to enter wherever they could. So that gets us to 1996, and now we're into the rule of law timeline and what's been going on that has been impacting these families so much and exponentially with COVID-19. Expedited removal officially began in 1996, which is exactly what it stands. We will remove foreign aliens from our grounds expeditiously, get rid of them as quickly as we can. And it started slowly and with particular people groups, and then it cranked up so that in September of 2005, it applied to anyone who was entering across our southwest border, so the U.S.-Mexico border. And then in 2005, we started Operation Streamline, which is mass production deportation. And that's how we could get rid of them as quickly as possible, lined up in courtrooms. They come in, sometimes shackled, sometimes not. And then boom, 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 deportation sentence, get rid of you, next line comes in. And so that mass production deportation started with Operation Streamline in 2005. We officially ended what was called catch and release. We ended that in 2006 under George W. Bush. And that catch and release is exactly like it sounds. And we would catch them, and then they would give them a time that they would have to make a report for their court hearing, and then release them, and they would come for the court hearing. So that all ended. We stopped being nice with that in 2006. The Customs Border Patrol has always had facilities along the southern border in particular, where it would be like detainment facilities when they needed a holding cell, so to speak. And the families refer to these as the hilera, the cooler, the ice box, the refrigerator, because when they're detained in them with the lights on 24/7 and the temperature kept so exceedingly cold that the families suffer. In fact, after they've made their horrific overland journey through Mexico, they would often tell me that the worst part of their journey was when they were received at the Customs Border Patrol facility in the hilera. And then under the Obama administration, he built the paredes, which would be the dog kennels that you've seen on television. Those were in July of 2014, these huge cages where the families would suffer more because they would be separated. The mothers traveling with their children, they would be separated by age and gender. And then we introduced the for-profit family detention concept, what immigration advocates refer to as baby jail. And they call it baby jail because babies are in these places. And they're called family detention centers, and that sounds all pretty nice, but they are still locked up, and it's still very much a jail feeling. So we started that also under the Obama administration. And that has... the Geo Carnes for-profit detention center is in Carnes City, Texas, and that has a capacity to hold 1,200 people overnight, mothers and children. And then Dilley, Texas, which is it's called Dilley, but it's also in Dilley, Texas, and that has the capacity of 2,400 mothers and children. So both of these they're in different directions, but they're 70 miles outside of the city of San Antonio, and so within an hour and a half radius, we can hold 3,600 locked up mothers and children. And then there's a smaller facility in Berks in Pennsylvania. Then we had the zero tolerance and the family separation fiasco in the spring and summer of 2018, where the children were forcibly pulled from the families that they were traveling with. Then we introduced what's called queue management, and it's blocking bridges, and so that we could, quote, turn back the, quote, inadmissible. Human rights advocates first noticed this in 2016. And so when you hear, oh, they entered illegally, well, they didn't enter illegally, and we blocked their access to enter this country. Then, of course, there's the border wall push. It was big in 1993, came again in 1996, and then, of course, the Trump administration has been pushing hard and building big chunks of the border wall, especially in the Arizona area. So the transition to the present, we have all of this coming on over the years, and then in March of 2019, all of a sudden, all of these families and individuals started to be rapidly released from the border, which on one hand, we're thinking, oh my gosh, this is fabulous. Thank you. The families are on their way to be with their families in the United States. This is wonderful, but there was no way to care for them. They were being released in such numbers all along the southern border. There was just no way to offer that humanitarian, compassionate assistance. And so just one example I'll share with you is that Travis Park Church, located in downtown San Antonio, which is a United Methodist church, from the mid-March of 2019 until mid-July, this church hosted 20,000 immigrants overnight, just for compassion and hospitality in their church space. And this church is located a block up from the bus stations. It was a convenient location, but a huge amount of generosity from the people in this faith community. Because otherwise, the families, they were stuck. They'd be on the street. There was no place for them. And then all of a sudden, the gate closed. From that steady flow, no more. Because the migrant protection protocols. That's the official name. The migrant protection protocols, often referred to as MPP, and also called the Remain in Mexico policy. That was implemented in January 24th, 2019. It started in California and then made its way east. So it hit Texas the third week in July. And we went from welcoming all kinds of families all the time to boom, zero, none. Zero, not at all. And so that was because the migrant protection protocols had kicked in. Well, about the same time, we also said, hey, we're going to have this third country policy going on where if you haven't stopped at a third country and that third country is safe and can welcome you, then you are ineligible for asylum in the United States. That all happened around the same time then that we brought in these tent courts at the U.S. border cities. So instead of families being processed internally where they would be with their families, which had been the previous process, they were released under the custody of their families living across the United States. So now we said, oh, no, you can't even come in our country to make your asylum claim. You have to remain in Mexico. We're going to bring the tent courts to you. So we put up tents, and then the families would be escorted to the tents with Customs and Border Patrol. After they have their hearing, then they would be escorted back across the bridge just to the edge and said, okay, you're on your own. Go find a safe place to stay until you come back in however many months before you have your next hearing. And so that happened. And then that was September 19 when we started doing this. And then COVID came. So things are really, really, really unjust and bad. And then we had COVID, and the border closed to all asylum seekers effective March 20th of 2020. The courts also closed. They went into terminal postponement, and at this time it seems that they might resume possibly in January of 2021. So the families are left in this space of waiting. They can't go home. They're desperately seeking asylum and fleeing violence. They need to be with their families in a safe place in the United States. So the current reality of all of this, I'll just give the example of Matamoros, Mexico, which if you know your geography for the United States, Texas is long and comes down to a point. At that point, that's Brownsville. The bridge from Brownsville to go over to Matamoros, as I said, that is behind me. So if you cross that bridge just to the left, literally right there on the edge of the river, there are 1,000 immigrants right now who are still waiting to seek asylum, and they have been stuck there because of COVID-19. Now, in the encampment itself, they've only had 3 or 4 cases, no deaths. So they're not suffering from COVID indirectly as far as the pandemic and the illness, but their suffering is because of the policies that we've enacted. Since I've been there, and most of it has very little international access now because of COVID. That's the excuse, so we can't go over. And so it's harder to get information. It's harder to know what's going on. There's some folks who still go over occasionally, but it's not the openness, the fluidness that it was before COVID. And now there's a chain link fence with rolls of barbed wire fully enclosing the encampment. There used to be a path that they could go down the river, and that was the place that they would, with their clothes on, they'd go in fully clothed, but at least they could bathe, and they would do their laundry there and bathe their children. That access point has been all cut off by the Mexico government, and the Mexico government also put this full enclosure around that looks like a penal facility, like they're in a prison. There's 2 gates to go in. One is permanently locked, the one that's closest access to the pedestrian bridge to Brownsville. So the one on the way far around the other side, and it's a security entrance that is staffed, and there's limited access to in or out on whether you can go in. Now, because the families have been stuck there for so long and are just in such an incredibly vulnerable state and place, the cartel has kicked up, and the cartel has caused fear and suffering. And the official count is that there have been 3 or 4 deaths, murders by the cartel of the families. But the word on the street in the camp that the migrants will tell you is that there have been 7 deaths. So there's an increased violence from the cartels, an increased suffering. Since COVID-19, there's a wonderful humanitarian aid group that prior to COVID-19 had gone over daily and provided meals, and on Sundays they went over and did education for the children and just solidarity and compassion and love with the families there. But since COVID-19, they're no longer, Team Brownsville is no longer going over like they were, and it is not because the families are unsafe for us going, it's that we would bring the risk of disease to the families. And so Team Brownsville is not going because we do not want to create an additional risk for the families. And so since COVID-19, there's just no foreign presence. There aren't foreign reporters or people going in. They're holding the Mexico federal government accountable for how the families are treated. And so they are really at the mercy of what the Mexico government will do. On a physical level, the physical conditions for the families, tropical storm Hannah came on the Gulf Coast on July 25th, 2020. And since then, the families have been sleeping in mud, because everything flooded. And with that flooding, with that rise of the water, and with that the mud came mosquitoes, rats, snakes, and spiders. It's disgusting. And there is no amount of bug spray that you can do to get rid of what these families are having to live in. So as Andrea Rudnick said, who's one of the lead coordinators for Team Brownsville, she said, quote, "It is beyond horrific," end quote. She also asks, how is it that Americans can so easily block this out as if it doesn't exist? They don't even give it a second thought. All they're worried about is COVID and whether or not their children will go back to school, end quote. And so again, it's not a direct hit on COVID as far as the pandemic and an illness for the families in this community. It is rather that they are being ignored and suffering because of policies and practices and disregarded thoughts of what's happening in the world, being distracted. So this is bringing an increasing sense of desperation to the families. Alma Ruth is a chaplain who goes as a volunteer 2 times a week, and she crosses into Matamoros to spend time with the families for spiritual care and solidarity. And in particular, her passion has been to be with the mothers who are pregnant and the ones who are from Central America, and is to spend time with them and with their small children. And the stories that she has told me of these pregnant mothers, as Alma said, they are throwing themselves into the river in desperation to try to get to the other side for safety. And they have these little air mattresses that you would sleep on, like a sleeping bag would go on, so not a real big raft kind of a thing that you would think for a summer event, just little blow-up air mattresses. And when the mother gets into labor, she pulls her 2 small little children, preschoolers, with her on this little blow-up air mattress and tries to paddle across so that she can have safety in the United States of America. And as Alma said, none of these people can swim. She said, what kind of desperation does it have that you have to have that you jump into the river for safety when you can't even swim? We need to stop using COVID-19 as an excuse to deny access to asylum. Restore asylum must be our battle cry. There is a sense of willful ignorance. People don't want to know what's happening, and they don't want to be held accountable to the injustice and these appalling practices at the U.S.-Mexico border. There is a denial of the reality that these are racist policies which are preventing the families from seeking asylum. And the United States is using COVID-19 as the excuse to justify these policies. So let me close by sharing one example from the interview I conducted with an ecumenical interfaith clergy on the topic of willful ignorance. It's a project I've been working on for several months now. So a white male associate pastor of a 3,000-member suburban megachurch located on the outskirts of San Antonio said, quote, "The shepherds are nervous because of their sheep. We're silent. I don't want the disruption. I don't want people not to like me," he said. And then he added, quote, "To me, it is like Schindler's List. We're just standing here watching the trains go by," end quote. These families are living in what Judith Butler calls a, quote, suspended zone, end quote. It's a space of non-belonging that puts the families in harm's way every single moment. The United States of America must stop using COVID-19 as the excuse to deny the human right to seek asylum. I would like to invite you to please join me in the battle cry. Stop using COVID-19 as an excuse. Restore asylum. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Goldstein Center for Human Rights and the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, thanks so much to our panelists, to Dr. Doña-Reveco, and to all of you for participating in our program. We hope you'll join us for future events.
So thank you very much to the presenters for this wonderful and really important presentations and messages. My role is to simply moderate and prevent there's any uncomfortable silences for too long. So if there's any questions, you can either please type it on the chat. I'm looking at it right now, so I can see at any point in time who will ask a question. If not, there's many questions that came to mind. Or many thoughts, in fact. One of them is to Dr. Kyle. The populist governments in Latin America are both from left-wing area and right-wing areas of the political spectrum, but they've reacted to this in a similar form. We haven't seen something like this, although not related to a pandemic, but maybe to other disasters since the 1930s in Latin America. Is this something absolutely new? The fact that it's scientific denial, is it absolutely new, or there is a long trajectory on this governments, on this populist governments that points up to what is now. And since there is a shared denial or shared policy, if we can call it a policy towards COVID-19 we have of this government, can we say that the scientific denial is replacing the traditional left-right continuum of politics in Latin America to a pro-science, anti-science kind of government?
Well, all right. Thank you for that question, Cristián. That's a lot.
Sorry.
So first, I would begin by saying, even if this isn't unprecedented with regard to populism, that doesn't make me feel any better. Reaching for historical analogs can sometimes be instructive, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about how to respond or how to make things better right off the bat. The issue of populism itself is that it's never really purely left-right ideological. I mean, that is part of the power of populism, is that it can be all things to all people in order to build a nationalistic kind of coalition that may span both left and right in the kind of conventional sense of how much the state is involved in an economy. It instead relies on nationalist mobilization and a sort of inside-outside perspective, rather than being something that's defined by, defined by that role of the state in the economy. I don't know that I would take it quite so far as saying, that this would define a new era of politics. But if that were the case, if you sort of think of it in terms of responses to modernity or responses to modern problems, that you can see a dividing line between a rationalist sort of Enlightenment era style response where politicians and their supporters seek to understand a problem and fight over the best way to respond, versus an alternative way of organizing the political fight, which is over whether the problem exists at all. And so I think, to an extent that is, you can certainly observe the evidence of that happening. I'm not sure that it's, unique to Latin America. Maybe the issue that's sort of confronting us with regard to the difference or potential similarity between now and the 1930s or any other past era of populism is maybe not so much about populism, but about science, which is to say, we know more now than we did in the 1930s. We have, you know, more advances, and yet that doesn't necessarily mean that we're more embracing of those scientific idea, you know, the scientific advances or the information that's presented by quote unquote experts. You know, there is reason to embrace skepticism even as we're trying to make advances scientifically, you know, whether that's in the hard sciences or in the social sciences.
Thank you. Just a short follow-up on that. The new government of Bolivia, the one that came through a military coup about a year ago,
Yeah.
It came to power with the calling itself a anti-indigenous, pro-religious, or very religious Christian government. How has that specific government reacted to COVID-19? It's not a strong government. It has many issues. It has several of its leaders have left government. So how has it reacted?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and Bolivia is one of the places in Latin America where we can see the way that the pandemic has affected politics itself. You know, so I presented my thoughts in the sense of how the pandemic is, how politics are affecting the pandemic and how the pandemic is affecting politics. And I think it's, you know, you can see kind of an inconsistent response from the government and inconsistent compliance with public health measures, you know, similar to other places. But the thing that has been really dramatic about the impact of the pandemic on Bolivian politics is that it hit at a time when the country was already in political turmoil after this contested election in October of last year that led to Evo Morales stepping down and fleeing the country, and the expectation that there would be new elections as replacement elections for those scheduled for May 2020, but they were delayed because of the pandemic. They were then supposed to happen in September of 2020. That has come and gone, and they were delayed again until October 18th, so coming up in a few weeks, because the number of cases were expected to spike over the last few weeks or so. That, you know, so that those disruptions have been very evident, and frankly, the opposition, you know, Evo Morales' party in particular, general opposition figures have leveled the accusation, at least, that the current interim government is using the COVID-19 pandemic as an excuse to keep delaying the elections. One final point to mention on this, though, is that Janine Áñez, the interim president, who was in the running for president up until last week, 2 weeks ago, dropped out. So I think we're likely to see Evo Morales' party come back into power, even though Evo himself is not running at this point.
Thank you. And to Dr. Cantisano, there's at least two questions, one from Dr. Alexander and the other one from me. Dr. Alexander asks, how much does the public health system in Brazil help poor communities versus wealthy? Do poor communities truly benefit from the public health provisions in the Constitution and in policy? And I wanted to add to that, if since Bolsonaro is attempting to change several policies, you know, regarding migration, environmental issues, and other, can he govern by decree and replace some of the public health components that are in the Constitution?
Well, thank you for those questions. I think as for the first question, Brazilian public health system, the national public health system, has been mostly for the poor, right? So Brazilian elites, it's a very unequal country. There's a tiny elite. Brazilian elites seek private healthcare because it is definitely more capable of, you know, holding up to complex diseases and complex surgery and things like that. But when it comes to sort of establishing
basic public health service, the system has kind of holding up to its promises, right? So there are problems, of course. I mean, especially in big urban centers that are crowded, and the hospitals cannot deal with all the demand for them. But when you go to other parts of the country, not too far, because too far then there's no access, but in certain sort of countryside parts of the, or smaller cities, public health system has holding up, let's say, decently for its purposes, right? So I think that to answer the question, it is extremely problematic. It has several issues with supply of medicine, of even doctors, right? So recently Brazil imported Cuban doctors, right? So to help, and yet, you know, there is some kind of basic access to public health. I would say that it's far from perfect, and yet because of the pandemic, people have defended it very strongly. Even people who might have previously criticized it very harshly are now defending the fact that this system has held sort of the country on a basic level to its promises, right? I think that the second question about dismantling the public health system, right? So that it has been under attack ever since it was created, right? So of course, austerity policies, health companies, all of the private medicine that exists in the United States exists to a lesser extent in Brazil, and they pressure government to privatize as much as possible this public health system. I think that what Cristián asked about completely dismantling the system by decree is not possible, right? It is not possible because it is written in the Constitution, and that's one of the points that I made. It's that unless there is a substantial change to the Brazilian Constitution, the most that an attack to this public health system can do is to erode its budget, even though there is constitutionally mandated part of the budget directed towards the public health system, right? So there are several mechanisms within the Constitution that guarantee the funding of the system. What they can do is, of course, erode it with several artifices within the budget to send money to, what's not necessary, or to send money to other areas that eroded from within. So I don't think that there can be a crush that can be completely crushed, but there could be a possibility that, so that's why people have been defending it, because it needs to be defended publicly. And I think the press and, activists, politicians have defended it during this pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Cantisano. I have a question for Dr. Boursier. Many governments in Latin America have used this, as both Dr. Kyle and you were saying, have used COVID-19 as a way of closing borders and militarizing even borders. I'm thinking in most South America, with the case of Venezuelan migration, something that happened. Do you think this is going to be a new normal after COVID-19? Or is there hope that at some point the militarization of borders and the closest of borders will recede?
Thank you. We need to make noise. For the United States, we need to make noise. It's the right time of the year to make a lot of noise. This has been a snowball that's been coming up to the point that it's at. And yes, it's a bipartisan issue. Yes, it involves everybody. But now is the time to be very vocal about it so that it does not become a new normal, because it's an unacceptable pattern that has also been going on in Europe. We need to restore asylum, and not only for, I mean, you could look at it from a selfish point of view, so that we can live into the image of this nation of being a welcoming place for refugees seeking asylum, and to think about what will that do to our nation. As one congressman in San Antonio said to me, the problem really isn't that people want to come to the United States. The problem is when they no longer want to come here. That's the problem. We need this nation to still be a place that is a safe place, and a place of justice, a place of peace, and a place of hope, not only for asylum seekers, but for all of those who live here. So I put in the chat, please write, call, visit your elected officials. Now is the time to speak up. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is a question from one of our students, Jennifer Sanchez, to all of you, I think. And I know the question might be a bit broad, and we could spend a year talking about this, which will be a lot of fun, at least for me. But try to answer it as close as possible. Or do you think that because of COVID-19, social structures will continue to change? Or due to COVID-19, will make social structures to change in a way that other events have not had the same effect? You can rephrase that. Is COVID-19 a revolution for social structures? Not in the Marxist term necessarily, but in a just overall revolution.
Who is that question for?
Anyone who wants to answer. It's broad enough for that the three of you can answer it.
Well, I had a Buddhist guest today in my online class for Introduction to Spirituality, and one of the tenets of Buddhism is that life is change, and that we have a lot of suffering in our own lives when we fight that change. So I would say that there is an inevitable change of this, and what is ours, and that's going to be our response. Will we change in a way that becomes more humane, more just, more compassionate? Or will we take another turn in a way that is not more humane, nor more just and more compassionate? And so it is what is ours to do individually, as a community, as a state, as a nation, and where do we have a circle of influence that we can make a difference and always lobby on the side of peace and justice. And what is ours to do would be my non-rhetorical question for all of us here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kyle, Dr. Cantisano, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Dr. Cantisano, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, as a historian, I can never even dare to predict anything. But I think that we thought, at least looking at the history of epidemics, there is precedent, at least for the history of Brazil, for example, that epidemics in the early 20th century created a sense of social connectivity, let's say. So viruses do not respect, even though they affect people differently, as we saw very clearly with the talks today, viruses do not respect sort of boundaries, they do not respect social class. And there was in the beginning of this pandemic some kind of hope that people would reconnect with the collectivity forcefully because of a virus like this, that people would recognize that we are interdependent and that they would change their minds about individualistic, egoistic challenges to public health policies, for example. Throughout those months, we've seen that many of those egoistic, individualistic claims, which a lot of the time are based on rights. Right? It is my right not to wear a mask, for example. Right? They were reinforced by the pandemic and the political divisions that were already in place. So one sort of optimistic way of looking at this is that the pandemic hit a moment that Dr. Kyle was talking about, of populistic governments. And that might change the story of those governments. So if you think of the counterfactual of how would this election be without the pandemic, maybe it's going to change for the better if you think about the moment in which the pandemic hit unexpectedly everyone, not only in the United States, but also Brazil and other places, right?
I'm not, despite the fact that I had the most time to think about this, I'm not sure I have a better answer than my colleagues here. I think what I have typically thought of regarding the impact of the pandemic in general, whether that's on politics or otherwise, is simply it depends on how long it lasts. In the sense that if we can sort of muddle through as a world or as individual societies and individual people for a year, maybe it doesn't have a really lasting impact. If it's 7 years, then, you know, by that point, people will have figured out totally different ways of living and working and so on, and that'll almost certainly have a lasting impact. If it's something in between, then I would say an uneven impact. That's probably an easy prediction to make. But I think what I would point to that we can already see and that I would anticipate moves into the future as a change in social structure and therefore a change in politics is the fact that this, you know, as Dr. Cantisano was saying, like the virus doesn't respect differences and so on, but the, you know, how resilient different people are, different groups are, does depend on how much money they already have, whether that's at the country level, the individual level, the community level. And so how vulnerable people are and what kind of responses they can take is kind of dependent on the status they already had when this hit. And so to that extent, I think you can see an event like this where we're able still to carry on our jobs and professional pursuits and so on, while not everyone is able to do that, right? And so, you know, we see this sort of like, you know, in terms of the economics of this, I think people are already, economists are already pointing to a K-shaped recovery, you know, meaning that some people are doing fine already. Other people, you know, their economic line, their trend is going down at the same time. So that is likely to drive us, you know, further and further apart as societies. That's not a very optimistic way of putting it, but that would be what I would anticipate as the actual impact of this happening. I think one thing to tie this to regarding leadership and so on, and the politics of it though, is that, you know, Cristián, the way you're putting this regarding a revolution, I would say in the popular mind, we tend to think of revolution as being spontaneous and a mass event. It's not. It's always a small minority that's driven by leaders. So that means that we're not helpless, and it also means that, you know, this isn't just some sort of like big wave that happens or doesn't happen. You know, this is going to be dependent on, you know, whatever the outcome is, whether it's a positive one or a negative one, is dependent on people making decisions and shaping those outcomes. And clearly those at the apex of social and political and legal institutions have greater impact than others. But it's really incumbent upon everybody to think about what they want in this critical juncture and how to shape the future.
Thank you. There is one more question that I have here, but you're welcome to ask any other questions. This is for Dr. Kyle again. You had mentioned that by May 2020, and it's from Ray Christensen, thousands of new COVID-19 cases were being reported daily, but new case numbers have lowered since. And I am assuming, of course, that this is Latin America. What factors have caused new case numbers to decrease? Is it that less people are contracting the disease, or is it an issue of reduced, not enough testing?
Thanks for your question, Ray. So I think the succinct way of putting this is to say that I don't want to put too rosy of a picture out there. The decline was a very short window, kind of immediately prior to the, you know, recording the video and making that statement that essentially the 7-day average from, you know, early September to mid-September was slightly lower than what it had been in the previous 7 or 14 days. So I don't think it's that we're really seeing, you know, a dramatic improvement one way or another. regarding testing, it's pretty clear that testing has been uneven everywhere. That said, I hesitate to impugn the numbers without a specific reason to do so. You know, just say like, well, you can't trust the numbers. Well, unless there is a reason why you can back that up of saying there is a problem with the numbers, then, you know, I would say we should probably not try to make that case.
And that also has to do a little bit with the unequal characteristics of the countries. We have some of the richest countries in the, well, not in the world, but we have some countries that have extremely high human development index next to countries that have extremely low human development index. There's some of them that we know very little what's going on, as in the case of Haiti and Venezuela in some way. So I want to thank, I'm not entirely done, but I want to thank Dr. Helen for the answers she's been providing on the chat. Those are really, really important. Please take notice and act, those who can. And I don't see any other questions. Dr. Alexander, do you want to ask anything else?
I think I'm good. So I think Dr. Doña, you can take us out of here, whether that's with another question and then a goodbye or just a closing.
No, I think that I have many questions, but that's just me, and I don't want to keep everyone just because I want to talk about this. So thank you very much for attending this Human Rights Forum CHARLA on pandemics and human rights in Latin America. I think it was a wonderful presentation. It was wonderful information from the three of you. I want to thank you for being here and for having the time to record this beforehand. And well, we're done with Human Rights Week. OLLAS will have a few other events. We have on October 13th, Dr. Daisy Reyes Verduzco will be here on Zoom talking about Latino politics in college campuses, which is very, very interesting. And we are participating in the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit, which is an exhibit that portrays all the people that have died in a segment of the border in the recent years. We have a opening of that. Dr. Alexander is going to be there. I'm going to be there. We're going to open that exhibit on early November. And yes, the exhibit will be available physically at Amplify Arts starting November 5th, if I'm not mistaken. So that is something else that it's connected to this and you might be interested. So thank you very much to everyone and have a good night.